Welcome to a supplemental episode of Ask a Pianist. My name is Andrew Ahrens, and I thought I would say a few more things about the subject of rubato in Chopin. When we really break it down, rubato is an extremely complicated element to control. We're tasked with grading our dynamics and sound quality according to time, and the change in time affects the resonance and how much time notes have to decay. Add to this the difficulties of choosing articulations that will benefit our choice of time and not interfere with our music making, and we have a rubato that may be well crafted but potentially unsuitable for the placement in the music that we've chosen for it. To be fair, after lots of practice and experience, for many professional pianists, the application of rubato is somewhat linked to instinct or feeling. We feel that time should be taken here, or that this special gesture should be milked for the audience, and we simply let the body take over. And the minor adjustments all happen automatically, without thinking. And in many ways, this is part of the reason I wanted to sit down with you today to talk about rubato a little more. When we're learning music as youngsters, we usually progress to a kind of order of operations, or steps in learning a piece. We first learn the notes, rhythms, and general dynamics. Then we memorize the piece, and then we start to think about larger structural issues, or fine details regarding our sound. We might experiment after this point with alternative interpretations, other ways of coming to the same conclusion. But when it comes to rubato, much of how we're taught is instinctual. What feels right? What do you want this phrase to say to an audience? Should we do more? Or is it inappropriate and sappy? Is it too subtle, needing to have more feeling? Is it romantic enough? We're essentially asking our teachers to help us to come to some understanding or compromise between what we expect of a rubato and what they expect. But it still comes down to mainly a question of what feels right. This is a difficult contradiction to me, and I think it should present a contradiction to you as well, one that you should think about very seriously. In Chopin, as I mentioned in the previous episode, there are many clues that can help us to determine the placement of rubato and, in some cases, the intensity of it. Sure, we have the hard comparisons between ornamented and non-ornamented melodies, which tell us rather concretely how much time will be necessary. But we also have the more subtle indicators, such as the underlying rhythmic structure and the melodic gestures that Chopin writes to flow with or counter against. One additional element that affects our use of rubato in Chopin is the intervallic distance between notes. You'll notice that sometimes when Chopin gives us a wide leap somewhere, there is a tradition to take time for that leap, that the distance between notes should be felt as something of a physical distance, something that the larger it is, the more time is required to cross. But as you approach the smaller scale in terms of the clues Chopin gives you, the potential for alternate readings of the clue increases substantially. This is one reason why you can compare several recordings of the same work by professional pianists and find wide variation on their use and implementation of rubato, especially when it comes to elements that are inside of a single gesture. But at least you have some guide, something that points to restrictions on when not to use rubato or when to limit its use. When we try to combine what Chopin tells us in his music with what our instincts tell us with regards to rubato use, then we begin to find problems. The most fundamental being, of course, that there is no guarantee when we are playing Chopin that our instinct for rubato is analogous or in concert with Chopin's instinct for rubato. In other words, we may feel to do rubato somewhere, but this may not be consistent with where Chopin felt to use rubato. We may feel rubato in the wrong place. When Chopin writes too many notes in too little time, he's giving us a reference point of sorts for a basic form of rubato. But he's also showing us that the elements of taking time and using rubato are inextricably linked to the physical playing of the work, not to be seen as add-ons or affectations that are solely within the realm of personal style. This is important to note. Chopin's music cannot function without the use of rubato. It's built in, and in these cases of ornamented melody, you can't remove rubato from the equation. When we learn rubato early on, we're learning from imitation mostly. Imitation of our teachers, and perhaps pianists we've heard on recordings that we like. We do what feels right, and we never think to question that feeling. And of course, the older we get, the more deeply entrenched those feelings become. But it's possible that this development of rubato creates a kind of quicksand foundation. We are learning from the feelings of older pianists, who probably learned from the feelings of their teachers as well. And let's be brutally honest for a moment. Feelings are very important for artists in their creation and craft. However, like any other part of the artist's development, musical feelings cannot exist solely in the realm of the unassailable, the unquestionable. The danger is that to question the feelings of an artist, either established or still developing, can be interpreted as a criticism of the artistry of the individual and their ability to express themselves. In other words, there are occasions where the justification to do something artistically would normally be able to be critiqued without a concern of offending anyone. For instance, debating the placement of the start of a crescendo or a differentiated articulation in a fugue. But if one were to critique the use of a rubato in a Chopin nocturne, then the perception seems to change. I feel that rubato should be used here. You cannot criticize that feeling, or else you're restricting my ability to express myself artistically. As tempting as it is to think of this scenario as being a rarity, or some extreme version of the musical debates that can occur between a teacher and a student, I have in fact seen this style of argumentation very often throughout my life. It comes from a confusion of influences which young artists are bombarded with as they develop through education and their early artistic life. On the one hand, they're told that the score is the reference. It cannot be changed or altered. On the other hand, they're encouraged to express themselves as individuals and to do things that no one else does. This is, in some respects, a direct contradiction and is very confusing for young artists especially. They're not taught where the areas of expression can be, and the further you get into understanding music in general, the more you realize that each composer has their own framework in which certain things must be precise and others are left open to interpretation. You can't change the pitches in Bach, but you can add rubato and ornamentation to the already existing framework, and you have almost complete freedom in terms of articulation unless it's specified in the score. It's much more restrictive in Mozart. You can't add ornamentation at all, you have to be far more strict with rhythm, and articulation must be precisely as written. In other words, it would be easier to express one's individuality in Bach than in Mozart, because there are more areas in which we have the freedom to choose what to do without interfering with the composer's modes of expression that are in the piece. With Chopin, we have yet another ultimate contradiction. We need to be free in order for rubato to sound natural, and yet rubato has boundaries in Chopin that are rather clearly demarcated. We have to know these boundaries in order to formulate rubato correctly. We can't just leave it up to our personal feelings. When you are discussing this with colleagues or students, the problem becomes one of, on the one hand, encouraging individual thought and legitimate challenges to tradition, and on the other hand, taking note or addressing seriously what Chopin is asking you to do. This is where the problem I outlined earlier becomes an issue. A young artist may think, I will put rubato here because it feels right. But on closer examination, the placement of rubato may be totally incorrect with what Chopin is asking us to do musically. The young artist may be enthusiastically doing something original and expressing their artistry, and yet it will still be wrong if we're taking Chopin's wishes into account. That is a very difficult thing to explain to a young artist who is unaware of these compositional limitations, and it can be interpreted as being a critique of their artistic soul rather than a critique of their musical technique, which is what it is in the most basic form. This is why I think it's vitally important for us to reconsider how we deal with rubato in Chopin, especially when we're teaching it. It's not something that is totally and freely up to our feelings. There are limitations of the location of where we can put rubato. However, I don't think there are limitations of how intense the rubato can be. That's more dependent on how we're playing the piece as a structured whole. It would be easy if these were the only considerations. But the problem is, of course, far more complex than this. We haven't yet even talked about the ultimate question in terms of rubato. Are we trying to move the audience? Is the purpose of rubato to generate or extrapolate feelings from people who are listening? And if so, then does any of this actually matter? When we perform on stage, there is a very clear perception of whether or not the audience is with us, so to speak. We can tell if they're hanging onto the edge of every note we play, or if they're bored to tears. We can hear if they're shifting in their seats, probably thinking about what they're going to eat afterwards. But we can also hear if no one wants to make a sound for fear of disturbing the magic that is happening on stage. This onstage perception influences directly our feelings and instincts while we're playing. If the audience is bored, we might speed up a bit or do something rather extreme in order to get their attention back. Similarly, if the audience is paying attention, then we allow ourselves to do more subtle things because we know they'll hear it. In other words, we adapt our playing style throughout the concert, depending on the audience reaction. And our adaptation is controlled mostly instinctually, because quite frankly, we don't have much intellectual power at our disposal while we're in the middle of a performance. If we adapt and change our rubato to suit the conditions of the ongoing performance, then we're usually exaggerating already planned rubato situations. In other words, if the audience isn't paying attention, then we might play a rubato a little slower and try to make our sound a little more beautiful, just to make a point that the audience will recognize. Conversely, if the audience is listening intently to everything we do, then we might make our rubato a little less obvious and change other parameters that require intense listening anyway. Sound quality, very subtle articulation and pedaling, and other things. But the point is that we've still done our homework beforehand. We know and have planned where to put rubato. The question is only how intense do we make it? So perhaps I would say that even if we're tackling the question of whether or not rubato serves to generate emotions in an audience, we still have the freedom to leave rubato up to our feelings during a performance as long as we already know where we want to put it. If we disregard the parameters that Chopin sets for rubato and perceive rubato as solely an emotional influence on an audience, then we tend to get the rubato that sounds out of place, where it moves the audience, but it makes little sense musically. This turns the music into a series of unconnected musical moments, each special and unique, but entirely out of context with each other. Once you remove the narrative, then all you have are sound effects that are interesting or pleasurable to the ear. This is the danger of following our feelings first regarding rubato in Chopin. By doing this, we risk interfering with the audience's understanding of the musical narrative in the piece. What we have to do is allow or accept that our personal feelings of rubato use must be open to criticism regarding the placement and, to some extent, the intensity, and that Chopin, in many respects, still has the final word on rubato. It's not a free, anything-goes scenario at all, even though the performance of excellent rubato on stage gives the impression of complete freedom. In a sense, that's the trick. That's the illusion that we're presenting to an audience. But it's up to us to help young artists understand what it actually is, rather than what it appears to be. So, that's it for this supplemental for Ask a Pianist. Until next time, keep on making music, and think carefully about your own musical and artistic feelings and how willing you may be to examine or even critique them. It takes some effort, but it is possible. And if you do so honestly, then you'll be open to more musical possibilities than you ever conceived of. Bye for now.